thank you so much for coming. It's a wonderful celebration of Murray. We're going to assuredly conjure his presence. And we're going to begin with his beloved wife, Naomi.
Thank you. Okay. Both Sigmund Freud and Murray Cohen would affirm Wordsworth's insight from his 1803 poem, The Rainbow, "The child is the father of the man." Freud riffed on it some 100 years later with his statement, "We are what we are because we had been what we had been." I thought that I would share with you some aspects of Murray's early life that helped shape the man we came to know. Of course, I didn't know him in those early years. We met when he was 54, but he did talk about events in his childhood and youth which made him become who he was. Murray was born in 1925 to Nellie and Jack Cohen, who owned what Murray would refer to as a tiny little grocery store, no bigger than our living room. From a very young age, Murray eagerly assisted in helping in the store, proudly accompanying his father to the farmer's market at what he called no o'clock in the morning, precisely shelving items in their proper places, anxiously learning to slice cold cuts and cheeses with great precision, a skill we enjoyed in his later life since he became a proficient knife sharpener for all our friends and a fine slicer of turkey and brisket at holiday dinners. He observed his father totaling purchases on brown paper bags and entering the sums in his modeled notebook of those who could not pay their bills during those difficult days of the Depression. Even less pleasant was his task of delivering groceries to the back doors of homes of his wealthier friends. Thus began his awareness of social and financial inequities and his identification with the working class. This carried over into his adult life. Murray was known as an excessive tipper of any working person who helped him, frequently embarrassing his fellow diners who were not quite so generous. And he would often be more engaged in conversation with waiters than those who were his dinner companions. In 1979, Boston University employees, librarians, secretaries, and staff went on strike protesting lack of raises in wages and benefits. Murray showed up day after day to walk the picket lines with them. As a result, he himself never received anything more than a cost of living raise in his salary, President Silber's revenge. Murray had no interest in school, although he did run track in high school and was on the boxing team. He loved to tell the story of how he would skip school in his senior year to go dancing at the local dance hall with his girlfriends who would pretend to be his mother, call school, and say that he was sick and could not come to school. His scheme was discovered when one day Nellie met his math teacher in the market, who told her that Murray was such a nice boy. It's a shame he's sick so often. His parents promptly withdrew him from school until they were assured that he would reform. However, his love of dancing remained with him his entire life. World War II was in full swing at this time, and at the age of 17 and a half, Murray enlisted in the Coast Guard, where he was trained to be a LORAN operator. He was sent to many islands in the South Pacific to set up LORAN stations along their peripheries, informing ships and planes as to their locations. He also entertained troops in boxing matches. In later years, he would squash down his nose to show that he no longer had any cartilage as a result of an unexpected blow from his left-handed opponent. So much of war is tedious and full of waiting hours, but that tedium led to a life-changing experience. Murray, who had never read a book in his life, had a bunkmate with a rucksack filled with books. To while away the time, he read one, which was a psychology text, the name of which he never remembered. But he never stopped reading after that. When he was discharged in 1946, he wanted to pursue an education. He had the GI Bill, but the only place he was accepted because of his poor high school record was a 2-year community college, where he was introduced to literature, German, French, science, and mathematics. While studying there, he learned that he had an intellectual ability that he had never been aware of. He fell in love with ideas and wanted to embrace a scholar's life. His identity was being transformed. From Bergen Junior College, he transferred to NYU, where he received his bachelor's degree, earned a master's degree at the University of Missouri, and then a PhD in clinical psychology at Boston University in a record 3 years. He was then asked to return to the Veterans Administration, where he had interned in his final year at BU for a staff appointment in the Acute Intensive Treatment Unit for veterans experiencing severe psychological disorders, schizophrenia, paranoia, bipolar disorders. But within 6 months, he realized that he was not suited to be of assistance to such patients. Fortunately, and to his delight, the chairman of the psychology department invited him back to BU on a research grant. When that ran out, he was put on faculty as an assistant professor, and 11 years later was appointed full professor. When Murray took the research position, his salary was half of what he had earned at the VA. So he took a part-time position with the Department of Mental Health in the newly created Center for the Sexually Dangerous Persons, located at the Correctional Center at Bridgewater State Prison. It was there that he pioneered the research on the classification and treatment of the sexual offender. After 25 years at that center, he, with 2 colleagues, Carol Ball and Theo Seghorn, he opened a group practice, New England Forensic Associates, a group focused on the treatment of sexual pathology. On a totally different path, Murray was invited by the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute to study as a senior scholar, and then was among the very few non-medical professionals accepted for training as a psychoanalyst. After he completed his training, he saw patients in psychoanalysis, taught at the Institute, and was considered an expert on Freud. Murray treated patients from all walks of life, including those who could not pay for treatment. Therapists who were trained by Murray Cohen would often grumble that they felt guilty about their fees because Murray always insisted that clinical decisions should not be made on a financial basis. His social conscience was ever present. In spite of his social and educational attainments, Murray never forgot his roots. When he had doubts about his proficiency in academia, he would echo the words of his revered psychoanalyst, Elvin Semrad, who observed that It's a long way from the grocery store to the university. It was a long way from the grocery store to the university.
For those of you that have a program, the Cohen family have decided to speak later in the program, so I'll be introducing myself. I'm Andrea Salenza. Murray was a very important mentor of mine, and I didn't know that he loved to dance. And I love to dance, and I can only think that we might have had some wonderful times dancing, except that I towered over him.
I have a photograph of you dancing with him at your wedding.
Oh, really? Oh, I'd love to see that.
Yeah.
I would love to see that. He was at my wedding, at our wedding. But actually, he towered over me, and I'll tell you why. I began my relationship with Murray through the professional route. Murray became a member of the Boston Psychoanalytic Society and Institute in 1972 after training as a psychologist, psychoanalyst. Naomi made reference to this. I believe he was the first psychologist to be trained without a medical degree. This was radical and trailblazing, and it required a fight. He was one to fight for what he believed in, and he paved the way for many of us. He was a member of the faculty there and supervised in the advanced psychotherapy training program, and he taught at BIPSI until well into his senior years and was a highly respected scholar of Freud. Everyone knew this. In 1987, he helped to found another institute, the Massachusetts Institute for Psychoanalysis, we call it MIP, dedicated by no coincidence to non-exclusionary training. That is, you didn't have to have a medical degree to get trained. He was already trained, but he did this for others. He did this for many of you in the room. And it was also dedicated to comparative psychoanalysis, in other words, to look at the different orientations of psychoanalysis from different points of view, not just Freudian, which was a generosity on his part. He was very Freudian. He remained a supervisor at MIP and on the faculty until his later years as well. But he began his professional career as a psychologist in the program of clinical psychology at Boston University, where he remained on the faculty for over 45 years. This is where I met Murray when I started graduate school in 1979. And my first impression of him was enduring. He was a careful thinker, it was obvious, an admirable theoretician, and a scholar of Freud. But mostly I loved how elegant a thinker he was, and I knew he would be my main mentor, literally from the first day that I started at BU. So I made him my first reader of my dissertation. And I will tell you that other students who knew him thought I was crazy to do this, because he could be a harsh critic. But I knew that my dissertation would be of a higher caliber if he was my first reader. So I did that. And I was intimidated by him at that time too. I think we all were. And I remember at the first cocktail party that gathered that year that they threw, I met Naomi and Murray at the cocktail party. And I went over, somehow gathering the courage. And Naomi was so warm and friendly. And Murray was very warm and friendly, outgoing. He couldn't have been nicer, couldn't have been more open to me, asking me all kinds of questions about my personal life. And I clammed up. I was so intimidated by this tower of a mentor to be of mine. This never happens that I clam up, by the way. So I was embarrassed later, and I felt so bad about it, it kind of haunted me. So I confided in friends. And one said to me, "Oh, Andrea, don't worry. Murray probably didn't notice." No, that would not be Murray. Another one said, "Don't worry, Andrea, Murray wouldn't care." Well, I kind of hoped he would care, you know. And then another said, "Oh, don't worry, Andrea, he won't make anything of it." Definitely not. So then a good friend of mine, Harris, who I hope is here, I don't know if he is, said to me, "Andrea, Murray would understand." And that put me at ease. But what became most important to me was Murray as a clinician. He was so patient and caring, loving. He had a deep understanding of people. And he told the class, a story that he was treating a patient who was in the midst of a psychotic episode, in a mental state of paranoid fear. And in that state, this man had bought a shotgun, and he was going to use it. Thankfully, he called Murray. And Murray convinced him to meet him in a parking lot one evening somewhere and to talk to him, which they did. And this conversation ended with the patient opening the trunk of his car, taking out the shotgun, and giving it to Murray. So Murray was courageous. He treated very, very sick people. To me, he was heroic. Lots of supervisors give you ideas about how to treat patients. They share their theories, new ways to work, pieces of technique. But Murray would give you what you need. For decades, he was a psychologist at the Bridgewater Treatment Center for Sex Offenders, which Naomi mentioned, and he was not afraid of severe psychopathology. Several years later, I called him from my internship setting. So I was no longer at BU, situated at BU. I was at Met State Hospital, which is an inpatient center, no longer exists, but treated the most severely disturbed patients you can imagine. And there was being organized a case conference of a patient who was a sex offender. And I knew that Murray had this tremendous knowledge of how to treat sex offenders, so I wanted him to be the discussant for the case conference. So I called him. And when he answered the phone, I got a little flustered and I said, Murray, I have a really important reason for calling. And then I remembered that we had a meeting coming up for my dissertation, so I said, oh, and then I have another reason that I'm calling. And then I remembered another reason that I wanted to talk to him. I said, oh, actually, I have a million reasons. And then I immediately became embarrassed because I was exaggerating, and I knew that he would see this as being an hysteric, you know. So I said, oh my God, I'm not really that hysterical. And he said, Andrea, just accept it. I needed that. And then he said, hysterics make good therapists. So I think it's not too much to say that Murray gave me my profession. When I became a training analyst at the Boston Psychoanalytic Institute, it was Murray that I really wanted to tell. And you have to understand, this was a status that was barred to him, because in his day, and when he would have been ready to achieve that status, you still had to be a medical doctor. And he fought against that, and that was part of founding the other institute. But by the time I was ready to become a training analyst, that battle had been fought, and he was part of it, and we had won. So I had become a training analyst. And we were sitting in the car, we were on our way to a talk or something. He was sitting next to me, and I told him that I had become a TA, a training analyst, a status that he himself never attained. And he sat there in his way, and I think that you can all, who know Murray, imagine this. He closed his eyes, and he had a big smile on his face. And I knew that he was happy for me, but he was also happy for himself, that we had done this together. Maybe even I had done this for him. And he was so happy for me, and he was very proud. And then our relationship became very personal. He helped me with my first marriage. And he loved Bruce, my second husband. He came to our wedding, and apparently I danced with him, which I don't remember. In the last years, I would say maybe the last 5 or 6 years, I would take him to talks at his beloved institutes, both BIPSI and MIP, or parties that either institute might have. And people always made a big fuss about him and all over him, and he loved it. And I was never sure, if we were at a talk, I was actually never sure he could hear what was being said, what was going on. But he always seemed to be listening. And at one, a couple of years ago, after the person gave their talk, during the question and answer period, Murray raised his hand, and the moderator called on him. And he said, well, I would like to share some thoughts about Freud. And then he recited about 4 sentences of Freud in German. It was beautiful. And then he translated into English. And it had something to do with tolerating uncertainty, which related actually to the talk. And everybody applauded. It was a beautiful moment. This is one of the final things he taught me about the uncertainties in life. And it's uncertain to me where he is right now, but I will never say that he is not here right now. But mostly, he taught me about the enduring nature of love and admiration.
I always have such hard acts to follow. I didn't know Murray professionally, and I didn't know him academically. I just knew him as a friend.
Pick up the...
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. What I just said is I didn't know Murray professionally. I didn't know him academically. I knew him as a friend, only for 35 years, but in 35 years you learn a lot about someone. And if someone to ask me, how would I summon up Murray Cohen in one sentence, I would say Murray Cohen was the most generous human being I ever met, the most generous man I ever met in my life. He was a giver, not a taker. And when we went to visit, went into the apartment, Murray wouldn't say hello to me. He would look at me and he would say, "Are you all right?" And for a while I couldn't understand why he was saying that. And slowly I began to figure it out. I always said, "Yes, I'm fine," and that was a mistake. I'm sorry sometimes I didn't say, "You know, Murray, I'm having some problems." Because what he wanted to do was to enter into a conversation with the Bill. And I said, that's all right. He said, it's on me. Murray thought he was going to pay for a meal. I said, no, we're going to split. So we did. And I looked at the bill afterwards, and he had put in a tip of 35%. Murray said he was known as an over-tipper. That's an understatement. And gradually, I brought it down to 30, to 25. You know, he was a very stubborn man. But I won that battle. I don't leave 35% tips. You are right, Naomi. He used to talk to the waiters sometimes, and the waitresses wanted to talk to us. And there were a few times when I thought he was going to invite them to sit down and I swear. That was Murray. Okay? Just one example of his extreme generosity. We were talking one day, and I said, "What did you do today?" He says, "Well, I had lunch with a friend in Brookline Village." He says, "I couldn't find a parking spot, so I parked illegally, and when I came out of the restaurant, my car was gone." I said, what do you mean? He says, they towed it. I said, what did you do? He had to take a taxi to the toll lot, which was in Somerville. He had to pay the towing charge. He had to pay the storage charge. And he said, the man who towed my car got my car for me. He says, he was such a nice guy. He said, I gave you $5. And I swear, there's a twinkle in his eye. I'm sure he did it. He said it to exasperate me. Because I would have spent the rest of my life hating that guy. I think of all the money I had to spend to get my car back. Not Murray, I gave him a $5. Naomi once told me part of the story. I don't know if it's true or not. I don't care because it's a characteristic episode. I think he and Naomi were at the Audubon in Cape Cod. Murray used to wear these funky berets, look very nice in them. And she said a man next to them made the mistake of admiring Murray's hat. So Murray took it off and gave it to him. That's Murray. And the man said, no. Okay, so a few weeks later, I saw Murray. He was wearing this fancy shirt. And I was about to say, Murray, that's a beautiful shirt, when a little voice in the back of my head. You know, for all of us and most human beings, I'd give you the shirt off my back as a metaphor. But for Murray Cohen, it was reality. And if I had said that to him, I'm sure he would have right out as weird as he was. Now, the other thing my wife and I used to like to do was to travel. In our early 20s, we actually took off for Europe and spent 10 weeks at a time when you had to sail by boat because there were no planes flying to Europe. And as we got older, we kept traveling, and we said, well, you know, maybe we should find someone we can travel with. It'd be more fun. So we went down a list of friends, and of course, by then, I was retired, and my wife was retired. And most of our friends were still working full-time, but Murray and Naomi were retired. So we said, let's try traveling with Murray and Naomi. And I found a totally new side of Murray. First of all, I hate driving, and Murray will not let anyone do anything for him that he could do for himself. So we didn't have to pay a driver. Murray was the driver. The first trip we took together was to Mexico. We flew into Cancun, rented a car, drove south, spent a few days looking around. After we visited one place, we got in the car, Murray turned on the ignition, and nothing happened. Silence. Now, if that were me, I would keep turning on the ignition until I exhausted the battery, and I'd be stuck in the middle of nowhere. Murray said no. He says, you, meaning me, get behind the driver's seat. He went out, he opened the hood, and I hear this mumbling, talking to himself and to the engine. Hear a little nothing. He says, try the... Now, Murray'd never seen this car before in his life. He says, try the ignition. I said, Murray, it's not going to work. I turned it and the car starts. Now, how did he do that? I don't know. I mean, only one other example from a trip we took. We went to Israel together, rented a car at the airport in Tel Aviv, drove into Jerusalem. We had reservations at the hotel, but they didn't have GDF in those days. We didn't have a map of Jerusalem. We didn't know how to find the hotel, so we drove around narrow streets. Finally, Murray said, there's a guy up there, I'm going to drive up into the driveway and ask him directions to the hotel. So I said, fine. And he went and he asked, he came back. He says, good. I said, what do you mean good? He says, this is the hotel. And to this day, I don't know if he was pulling my leg and all the time, or by accident or intuition, his genius prompted him to drive into this strange place, which happened to be the hotel. It's amazing. At one point, I felt there was nothing he was not able to do, and that continued to amaze me. My wife and I bought a house in Wellfleet, out on the Cape. Murray and Naomi came out often to visit us. In a few years, I retired, had to empty my office out at Simmons College. I had hundreds of books. I had no room at home because it was all filled with books already. So I brought them out to the cave and put them on the floor. And Murray saw them there. He said, "Why are they on the floor?" I said, "Oh, I'm in bookcases." 2 weeks later, Murray and Naomi arrived at the cave with a ton of lumber in the back seat. Now, if I were doing this, I would buy pine board or some cheap wood, and paint it. Solid oak. Hundreds of feet of solid oak. And we spend weekends for weeks building. He did most of the work. But we did it together, and that was fun, sawing and building bookcases. This 25 years ago. I said, "Murray, why did we need solid oak? It was expensive." He wouldn't let me pay for it. And Murray, in addition to being the most generous human being in the world, the most stubborn human being. And if he got an idea in his head, that's how you have to do it. I said, "All right." But I paid for it because Murray said he didn't like to finish with. So I had to stain all the bookshelves, and put a permanent finish on them, and it's a dirty job, and you get this glue all over your hands. But those bookcases are there as a monument to the expertise, because he was a wonderful carpenter. But that's not all. He's really shrewd. He came to own half the house without paying anything for it. He looked in the bedroom. He said, "These are the crummiest night tables they ever saw." 2 weeks later, Murray, solid oak, 3 solid oak night tables for the bedrooms. Every shelf in that house was built by Murray. The cutting board was built by Murray. The napkin holder was built by Murray. Really, I was waiting for him to put a claim on the house, but he never did that because that was Murray. 2 final examples of Murray's caring. I never heard him say, now most parents love their children, admire them, but many parents also feel that the children sometimes make mistakes, have bad plans for the future, have friends or partners they don't approve of. I never heard Murray say one critical word about his children in his life. I said to myself, "Come on, Murray, something." He supported them in ways that I'm not going to talk about, but that I never stopped admiring him. And it paid off, because in the closing weeks of his life, I was filled with awe at the care and the comfort that Murray's children, I witnessed this, Murray's children gave to him in the closing days of his life. And this leads me really to my final point. It's my last example of caring in the life of Murray Cohen. Unfortunately, in recent years, I've attended more of these memorial services than I like to remember. But one thing unites them all. No one ever says anything about the surviving spouse. So I'd like to say just a few words in conclusion about Naomi, because now Murray was in decline for at least the last 6 months of his life, mentally and physically. Naomi has health problems of her own. But I witnessed a care and a concern and a patience that I've rarely witnessed before in a spouse when her husband was slowly dying. Now, somebody mentioned something about hearing aids. Even with his hearing aids, Murray was totally deaf. He just couldn't hear. Now, some people, I'm not talking about myself, but some people find that the members of the family get irritated when you say what to them and get exasperated. Instead, Naomi would repeat. If Murray didn't hear something, instead of saying, why don't you turn up your hearing aid, she repeated it to him. What we don't know is the kind of care, devotion, and love Murray gave to Naomi during all those months when they were alone, because there were no witnesses. But I'm sure. Now, we knew Murray for 35 years. You know, I don't like to admit this because it says something about how old I am, but we knew Naomi for 70 years. 70 years. And I often ask myself, I don't remember what she was like 70 years ago. Whether I could have said about her then what I can say about her now. She is the most generous woman I have ever known in my life. And I sometimes think maybe that's what drew them together. They discovered in each other this kind of generosity which exists in very few people that brought them together. So let me conclude with a twin tribute to the memory of Murray, whom I will never forget, and to the presence of Naomi, and long may she thrive.
Louder. Thank you. My name is Olivia Viana.
I don't think, can you hear?
Can you hear at the back?
Yeah. Little more.
Higher. Okay. My name is Olivia Viana, and I'm one of Murray's students. I met Murray in 1987 at the Clinical Psychology PhD program at Boston University. At the time, he had quite a reputation as a teacher, mentor, and colleague. My first impression of him was of a man full of contradictions. He was a religious man. Judaism was replaced by Freudianism. He was warm, but occasionally unforgiving. He was both endlessly patient and at times deeply critical. But I know the Murray who was loving, supportive, compassionate, artistic, and endlessly generous. On reflecting on which of the many lessons that I have learned from Murray I could share today, the one that shaped my own practice the most was his admonition during my first year of graduate school to hold space in our future private practices for people who sought and needed our help but could not afford it. As was often the case with Murray, this was not merely a suggestion, but rather a moral position. And he was specific. A quarter to a third of one's practice should be reserved as pro bono. Years later, I shared with Murray my recollection of that instruction. He was surprised, but rather pleased that his words carried so much meaning and influence. Another aspect of Murray that I loved was his willingness and at times eagerness. He was a boxer in his youth, after all, to engage in debates about Freud and his legacy. The joy he derived from discussing and interpreting Freud's work was contagious. When I once disagreed with him and wrote a paper articulating a position which he found erroneous, he did not rest until he made sure that I understood fully how wrong I was. When I smiled and suggested that perhaps our life experiences informed our differences, he attributed my wrong-headed views to my youth. I knew he cared about me very deeply to let me off the hook by offering such a benign explanation. Above all, the Murray that I knew for many years as a mentor and as a friend was a compassionate and warm person, and most importantly, the loving husband of Naomi, and a proud father and grandfather. He was complicated, like anyone who lived such rich life and touched so many people. May his soul rest in peace.
Cohen, and this is my daughter Alexandra. We came today from, of all places, Colorado, to remember, to celebrate, and to mourn our dear friend, Marla. We speak for ourselves and for my late husband, Jonathan, who loved Murray so deeply. People will speak of Murray's many academic and professional accomplishments, his contributions as a psychoanalyst, a psychologist, and a professor. He was a highly regarded scholar, teacher, and practitioner. This was his public persona, and the respect and accolades were well-deserved. But Murray was so much more. He had a boundless love for life and an almost childlike exuberance for all that he did. He joyfully participated in activities such as tennis and gardening. I used to leave my perpetually dying plants on his doorstep, asking him to stop me before I killed again. He loved to discuss, to teach, and to learn. He was imaginative, inventive, and always willing to try new things. Jonathan and Murray spent many evenings exploring art projects and carpentry together. Their conversations were erudite, spirited, and frequently filled with laughter. But most of all, Murray was family. We saw the flip side of the distinguished man. He was imposing, yet never supercilious or patronizing. He was brilliant and renowned, but also funny, generous, and loving. He had a great sense of humor. I kidded him relentlessly, and although I admired him on so many levels, I took great pleasure in teasing him. Many of our happiest memories are of the Seder's we shared on Emerson Road, where year after year Murray would hide the Afikoman in the same spot. He was a mentor, role model, and beloved friend to Jonathan and to me. He was a surrogate grandfather to Alexandra. His love for us was unconditional. Our love for him was profound and enduring. Murray, you will be sorely missed, but never forgotten. We carry you in our hearts and rejoice in the gift of your friendship and the memories we treasure. Rest in peace, dear friend.
Ackerman, I'm a okay. I'm a psychoanalyst. I practice in Hanover, New Hampshire, and I'm going to tell you the story of my relationship with Murray, beginning with the way I met him. 20 years ago, I was working at McLean Hospital and hoping to start a private practice. Because I didn't feel ready to commit to renting an office and all the expenses that came with that, I opened up the phone book and called every therapist practicing in Arlington, Massachusetts, asking if they would consider subletting their office to me for 4 hours a week. I heard back from one person, Murray. He called me at home and said that he would like to meet me before deciding. He wondered if I could come in that day. I said I was sorry, but that I was at home with my 2-year-old son. Bring him in with you, Murray said. And so I did. And when we arrived, my son was delighted because Murray pulled out an enormous box of candy and suggested that my son should have one for each hand. And then Murray and I chatted in his office and the deal was done. It was Murray's decision to charge me only for the hours that I was able to fill, a tremendously generous offer that was clearly designed to support my needs over his own. This generosity was an aspect of Murray that I came to encounter again and again as I got to know him. 3 years later, Murray co-taught a class on perversions at Pine, where I was a candidate, and I became intrigued with Murray's extraordinary grasp of Freud. I heard him say that he felt like a dinosaur. The contemporary psychoanalysis made no sense to him. I asked to meet with him privately and confessed to him that I desperately wanted to know how to think like a dinosaur. I wondered if he would be willing to do an independent study of Freud with me. I did not expect Murray's magnanimous response. He suggested that I find a partner to join me. I found Pamela Greenberg, and we meet at his house every other Thursday for as long as it took for us to work our way through his selected texts from the Standard Edition. So every Thursday we met at his house, and thinking back, I recognized Naomi's touch in providing the delicious assortments of fruit and cookies and snacks for our meetings. I learned so much from these meetings, which spanned over 2 years, and I feel they were essential in shaping my identity as the analyst that I am. It's now been 14 years since we ended this project, and I've returned to Freud again and again. He is the ballast of my identity as an analyst, and I understand him through Murray's deep and broad-ranging perspective. These meetings led to a friendship. Naomi and Murray kindly welcomed me into their home for dinners. I felt so welcomed at their dinner table and greatly appreciated the interest that both Naomi and Murray sustained in my life and well-being. I was delighted then when Murray offered to accompany me on teaching ventures that I undertook in my early years as an analyst. It was clear that he loved being in a classroom, but I also felt that he was gently showing me his style of extending himself very kindly to his students, while also encouraging them to see new vantage points. If the theme here is generosity, it certainly continues. When my family moved to Hanover, New Hampshire, Naomi and Murray invited me to stay at their house on my Thursday nights in Boston. I was touched to be made to feel like family in their home, and it certainly felt beyond my wildest expectations. But there is another aspect to Murray's generosity that I wanted to elaborate, and that is Murray's willingness to share stories of his life that helped me to understand what it is to be a psychoanalyst. My feeling is that Murray had an unusual ability to make use of his unconscious. When Freud was writing The Interpretation of Dreams, he wrote to Fleece that he felt that the book was writing itself, beyond his awareness. Murray told stories that illustrated his own ability to follow instincts that weren't entirely conscious. I recall his stories of skipping out on high school to go dancing, or the story of him walking out of his interview as an applicant to BIPSI. And I want to underscore, as Andrea did, it was a big deal that he was even being invited to apply to BIPSI as a psychologist, and he's in the middle of his interview. But they asked him what in his personal history informed his interest in perversions. And he was so taken aback by the question that he excused himself, left the building, and walked around the block to think about it before returning to the interview. And I was charmed by Murray's relative immunity from normative social pressures in that story. Murray has also told me many things that I repeat again and again with students and supervisees. His stories exemplify a psychoanalytic vantage point at its best. They show that he never shied away from being a person with his patients and making clear how much he cared about them and the treatment. That is an extraordinary embodiment of analytic ethics, and it's one that I aspire to live up to every day.
I'm David Doolittle, and Murray was my supervisor, teacher, my mentor, and my friend. I came to Boston in 1984, eagerly wishing to become a psychoanalyst at a time that it wasn't possible to become a psychoanalyst as a psychologist. But very soon after I got here, oh God, I'm gonna fall over. Very soon after I got here, there was a circular that came around from MAP, the Massachusetts Association for Psychoanalytic Psychology, saying that a new institute was going to be formed and that it would accept applications from non-medical professionals, mental health professionals. So, and Murray was deeply involved, as Andrea mentioned, in that venture. I actually met Murray as a result of, once I got finished with my dissertation in January of '85, I embarked, I took an object relations course through MAP actually with Steve Cooper, who some will know here. Steve, I think, was still a candidate actually at the time. I don't even think he graduated from training at that point. And I've become very involved in working with sexual abuse and sexual offenders in Norfolk, Virginia, where I got my doctorate. And so I said to Steve during the course of those meetings, I said, I'm working with these sexual offenders, I really would love to get some supervision. Could we set up times for supervision? And Steve said, well, I'd be glad to do that with you, David, but you should really meet this guy named Murray Cohen, because he's the one who actually knows about this stuff. So I called up Murray and went in to see him in his Boston University office. He was sitting in a green leather chair, I remember, and when I finally opened my private office, he gave me that chair, which I used for many years. As long as I could, I used that chair. And he was so, as everyone has said, he was so encouraging to me, both in terms of my interest in my career, and certainly, taught me much of what I know, a great deal of what I know about sexual offenders, who I'm not working so much with anymore, but have really benefited so much from that knowledge. But I think it's his mentorship really that meant the most to me. I was, after I finished my dissertation, I was working at HRI, Human Resource Institute, which was a sort of a clinic that existed at that time. And I was looking around for a permanent job. I'd been working part-time finishing my dissertation. And so I had two job possibilities. One was working at Tufts Medical Center in the sexual abuse program, which had done research and was really developing a lot of knowledge about sexual abuse and sexual offending. And the other was to be a clinic director at HRI. The clinic director job paid $40,000, and at that point in my life, that was a huge amount of money, I have to say. The job at Tufts Medical Center paid $22,000. Okay, so I said to Murray, "What do you think I should do?" My wife was pregnant at the time, I should add. And Murray said, which I've never forgotten, I've told so many students this over the years. He said, "If you follow what you love, the money will follow you." And that was probably the best advice I ever got. So anyway, Murray was enormously helpful in my development working with sexual deviants. His work at Bridgewater Treatment Center was mentioned. One thing that hasn't been mentioned so far is that he developed a typology of child sexual offenders, differentiating fixated or pedophilic child sexual offenders from what he coined the term of regressed child sexual offenders, a tremendously powerful theoretical construct which I used a great deal in my work with offenders. I came to work later on at the Framingham Youth Guidance Center doing consultations, and we were involved in a sexual abuse program, and people really needed some help. And Murray said, "Bring the whole group in. We'll do consultations with everybody." So the whole team went in and did consultations with him around our cases that were enormously helpful. So, wanting to become a psychoanalyst at that time, my institute, MIP, was in the process of being formed. And Murray, deeply encouraged me. I think his mentorship, along with the mentoring that I received from Paul Meyerson, really are the reasons that I was able to become a psychoanalyst. I was one of these people who sort of believed that, you could become a psychoanalyst if you were somebody other than me, like other people could do that, but I could never do that, But these two men helped me to believe in myself that I could actually become an analyst, which has been really a terribly important part of my professional life. So Murray was very involved in the formation of MIP. He was in the planning committee that originally developed the Institute. He was the first chairperson of the education committee. As we know, Murray could be feisty and determined, but as has already been mentioned, he could be quite stubborn. And I have to say that in the early years of MIP, his gifts and his dilemmas were strongly on view for everyone in those early days of MIP. He was, as we have mentioned, as everyone knows, he was a fierce advocate for Freud's ideas. And I believe that he was a large part of the fact that a focus on Freud's writing continues to be an important part of MIP's curriculum, even though we are a much more contemporary psychoanalytic institute. So Murray supported me a great deal in my life and in my career. We clashed not infrequently and really butted heads often, But I think we both loved each other a lot and found our way back to each other because the relationship meant so much to both of us. He supervised my third analytic control case through MIP, consulted on many cases with me over the years. And as the years passed and I was established in my career as an analytic practitioner and teacher, the relationship really evolved into lunches together. We would have lunch a couple of times a year, always at Lex in Lexington Center, if any of you know that place. And we carried on just a very warm connection over those years. The last years were difficult. I think one of the last visits, Murray's dementia was developing quite rapidly, and having lost my father to Alzheimer's disease, I think it became very tough for me to see him at the end. But Murray, you know, as a teacher and mentor, and I have to say as a father figure, was very important to me and always will be. Thank you.
So first off, I just want to say I'm humbled and also very thankful for everyone that's spoken up till now. Amazing, yeah, to see the impact that my father had on so many different people. Mine is going to be short and sweet. So about today's memorial, if he were able to, I think my dad would suggest that we are attempting the impossible. To set aside our grief, to deny the sadness from our loss, so that we can stand up here and somehow, some way, distill into a soundbite our unique experiences and relationships with him and what he meant to us. I would agree with this. With that in mind, I'd like to share with you an observation, a memory, and lastly, gratitude. As it's been said many times here, my father was a joyous man. And he shared that joy with the people around him. He was generous with it. His work, the good fortune and accomplishments of others, good food and drink, art, music, literature, theater, woodwork, botany, astronomy, skiing, tennis, chess, these things and many others brought him immense joy. I'm fortunate that he shared many of these things with me. And having his family around him probably gave him the most joy of all. When I was a young boy, my family would occasionally go out to dinner at a restaurant, and while sitting at the table, my dad would spontaneously break out into song. Not under his breath, but singing out loud, full voice, and usually off key. My dad was not a trained singer, and he was not afraid of exposing that fact. As you can probably imagine, the instant and unanimous attention focused at our table was quite embarrassing to all of us, except for Murray. At the time, I resented this behavior. I was young, after all. I assumed his motivation was intentional embarrassment or merely attention grabbing. This behavior would continue over the years, sometimes replacing songs with shouts, yelps, and the occasional barking. With time and experience, however, I came to realize that in those situations, in those moments, my dad was so full of joy, in the case of the restaurant, being there with his family, that he literally could not contain it. That was his expression of immense joy. Unabashed, unashamed joy. And I think that's wonderful. I am very thankful for the joy that my father shared with me throughout his life.
So I do want to echo my brother's thanks. Thank you all so much for being here. Thank you all so much for being here. A very good friend of mine, Tony Snow, who knew that my father had been ill but did not know that he had entered hospice care, sent me the 5 remembrances of Buddha, actually just days before my father died. So I wanted to share those with you. I don't know how she knew to do that, but she did. And they are, I am of the nature to grow old. There is no way to escape growing old. I am of the nature to have ill health. There is no way to escape having ill health. I am of the nature to die. There is no way to escape death. All that is dear to me and everyone I love are of the nature of change. There is no way to escape being separated from them. My deeds are the closest companions. I am the beneficiary of my deeds. My deeds are the ground on which I stand. So those of you who knew my father, probably not even well, but even just a little bit, knew that he wasn't really a spiritual man or a religious man. In fact, one of the things he loved to say was that God is dog spelled backwards. But I think that he really would have appreciated the 5 remembrances, in part, I think, because of what my brother was pointing out, that he fully understood that being a human being means experiencing loss, and he made the absolute most of every moment he had, made sure that his life was full of joy and knowledge, even though he knew that it was going to end, as we all do. So I think that's it.
Some of this may sound repetitive. I really appreciate everybody who's here. Oh, okay. I realize some of this may be repetitive. I just want to say my appreciation for everyone who's here to honor Murray. And I appreciate everyone who's speaking, because together we can make a more complete picture of who Murray is. I want, for my part, to talk about what I'm grateful for. I am so grateful that Dad imparted in us his love of life, his curiosity, his love of learning, and his love of knowledge. I am especially grateful to our dad and our mom, Janice Carroll, who taught us about giving to others and learning from others, and that no one person is more deserving than any other. And those are words I really live by.
Murray was my father-in-law, so I've known Murray for the better part of the past 20 years. Murray was a very inclusive man and a formidable man, as many people have talked about already. When I first met Murray and came into the family fold, I was just entering a substance abuse field. And as many of you know, Murray could have some very spirited conversations, and you better know what you're talking about. And being new in the field, I wasn't as well versed as I am now, maybe, I don't know. But he really had me on the hot seat there for a little bit. But you know, I watched him over the years, and he did that a lot, and it didn't mean that he didn't love you or respect you or care about you. He just wanted to know what you thought about things. The other really fond memories that I have of Murray, growing up Irish Catholic, my first Seder with Murray Cohen and the clan was something to remember, and it's a beautiful thing to see Murray hold court and, you know, just be so happy just to have his family. And his family included a lot of people. You didn't have to just be related by blood. He included a lot of people and considered them family. I think for me, that is probably one of my best memories of Murray, is that I always felt included as part of Murray's family. Murray always introduced me as his daughter's wife, or as his daughter-in-law, or as part of the family. And I sometimes felt more part of his family than I did my own, and I was always really very grateful for that. I'm gonna really feel the loss of Murray. Murray felt sort of like the sun, like everybody orbits around Murray. He took up space and he could fill a room, and people gravitated towards him. All I can say is that I was really grateful to be part of his orbit. I think was unable to come. He was going to give a prayer, even though Murray is, not religious. He promised a to whom it may concern kind of prayer. And Bill Fortier, who has a religious background as well, has gracefully volunteered to stand in his place. And then we'll open up the floor for others who would like to speak.
So first I want to say we noticed that we just come together. And that's the most important thing. We come together and we bring our thoughts, our hearts, and our prayers together too. John McMurray said that to believe in God was to believe that life was personal. To believe in God was to believe that life is personal. Freud taught us that to believe in God was to hold on to our childhood. To believe in God was to hold on to our childhoods. Just this one story. A group of reporters corralled Albert Einstein's wife and began peppering her at the front door about his newly espoused theory of relativity. And someone finally said, "What do you know about relativity?" And she said, "Not a damn thing. But I know my husband, and you can trust him." What do I and we know about death and its meanings? Not a damn thing. But we do know you, Naomi, and we did know and we do love Murray, and we can trust that. Amen.
The rest of the program is for you. Would anybody like to share their thoughts, remembrances, memories, wishes, anything?
Boston University Clinical Psych Program. I trained with Murray at the university, taught psychoanalytic theory, and then I worked with him for 9 years at the treatment center for sex offenders in Bridgewater. And I would often meet Murray in court when we were testifying on cases afterwards. So I'm going to share two stories. First of all, I was part of the angriest class at Boston University. The year that I was admitted, they allowed the current students to be involved in the decision-making process. And my understanding is they never did that again. And my class was very angry and furious, mostly at the clinical psych professors, because there was a sense that we had come through this arduous process of getting into this program and they weren't prepared. They were just talking and seeing what happened, except for Murray. Every lecture of Murray's was carefully thought out. He would present his ideas, the Freudian stuff, and it opened up a whole world. I became a little bit of a Freudian scholar from that interaction. And he would always leave time for discussion, challenging ideas at the end. But because he was the chairman of the psych department, of the clinical psych of the psych department, I think, of the whole department, he became a lightning rod for all the anger, because everyone was angry at the other professors, And Murray became a lightning rod for it, and he was seen as authoritarian and closed-minded, because he couldn't do anything about the other professors, right? He didn't have any real control over them. They're professors, they have tenure and everything. So one day he invited people in my program up to his cabin, I think it was New Hampshire, and it was a freezing cold day, and we went out sledding, I believe. We walked like a quarter of a mile in the snow, and I cleverly came in my sneakers, and not thinking that I could handle the cold. And I was getting scared because my toes became numb, and then they became painful. And I was embarrassed because I didn't want to admit that I didn't know how to go out in the snow. I mean, I lived in the Northeast my whole life. And Murray, when he saw my distress, he rushed me back to the cabin, turned up the fireplace, put me in front on a chair with my feet up on it, took my shoes off, got me a hot toddy, and I'm looking at this guy that everybody is so intimidated by, and he was the most nurturing human being I've ever experienced in my life. He really took care of me. There are a lot of other stories I could tell you about. I'll just say one other thing. I knew Murray in the 70s when I think it was Linus Pauling was touting vitamin C to prevent colds, and I was taking 500 milligrams of vitamin C. I think Murray was taking 1,000 or 2,000. And I was questioning, and I was reading their research, and it's coming out, and questioning whether it's really worth anything. And Murray swears by it. He says he's been taking these 2,000 milligrams of vitamin C, and he's never had a cold. So 6 months later, a year later, I don't know how long, because we were there a long time, Murray comes into the treatment center, and he's sniffling, and mucus is running down, his eyes are all red, he's sneezing, he's obviously got the worst cold in the world, and I'm in supervision with him, and all of a sudden it strikes me, wait a minute, Murray, you said you'd never get a cold from taking vitamin C. And Murray looked at me and he said, I do not have a cold.
I shared very little with Murray. We shared the fact we were in the Navy in the Pacific about the same time. We both loved working with our hands. We both loved my cousin Naomi. Intellect, we certainly didn't share. All I can say, I have one very short story. My wife and I have a small business in West Newton. One day a man came in and we were talking and he said, he mentioned that he was a psychologist. I said, oh yes, I have a cousin who's a psychologist. He says, yeah, who? I said, Mary Cohen. He said, oh my God, he said, when you see him, tell him I worship him. And some time later, this same gentleman came in the shop again, and he said, you know, he asked how Murray was, and at that point, Murray wasn't doing that great. And I said, well, he's okay, but not doing that great. He said, do you know that Murray is the most respected person in his field in New England? And everything else about Murray has been said. I miss him.
Feel free to keep thinking about what you're going to say. I have something to read from Leslie Brody, who was a colleague of Murray's at BU on the clinical faculty. I knew her well. She was not able to be here today because her daughter got married today, so I thought that was a good reason. It is with great sadness that I think about Murray's passing and extend my deepest condolences to Naomi and his family. I also have fond memories of mentoring his daughter, Deborah, when she was an undergraduate psych major at BU, and say a special hello to her and Naomi at this sad time. Murray was the director of the clinical psychology program for many years in the 70s, and he was one of the faculty members who interviewed me for a position as assistant professor in 1978. The interview took place in his unforgettable BU office at 64 Cummington Street, in which he also saw patients. He kept the room dimly lit, with only one lamp lighting a small corner of the room, creating a personal and warm space that felt quite distinct from the hustle and bustle of the rest of the building. Throughout the 25 years that our careers overlapped at BU, he was often a source of wisdom and advice for me, especially around how to manage the role of being the director of the clinical program, a role I took over some years after he stepped down. He was brilliant and had an encyclopedic memory, especially for all things psychoanalytic. I once went to him looking for the source of the often quoted "Anatomy is Destiny," attributed to Freud, and he immediately pulled out 2 books, even turning to the exact relevant pages from the Ernest Jones collection of Freud's work, where I learned that rather than this quote referring to social inequities based on gender, Freud used it to refer to the anatomical proximity of the excretory and sexual organs and consequent associations between the two. As was often the case, we had a lively dialogue about this. Murray would often tease me about not being psychoanalytic enough in my work until one day he looked over a syllabus for a course I was teaching on family relationships. Many of the readings were written by object relations theorists, and Murray, delighted with his discovery, made sure to let me know that I was now a bona fide psychoanalytic thinker. I felt like I had passed an important exam that I didn't know I was taking, but earning Murray's respect was no small feat. He could be intimidating. He held himself to very high standards and held others to those same standards, and he wasn't shy about letting people know they had disappointed him. On the other hand, he was often quick to forgive. Conversations with him inevitably led to gaining a deeper appreciation for the complexities of the human mind and behavior. He was devoted to his students and taught hundreds of undergraduate and graduate students at BU over his career there. Many of them spoke about important personal and intellectual insights they gained through taking his classes. He also advocated tirelessly on behalf of the faculty, which tended to be anti-psychology when John Silber was at the helm. He was a senior spokesperson for us, in one case helping to overturn an unfair tenure decision by visiting Silber in person. He had a solid moral compass about what was just and what was unjust, and tirelessly fought what turned out to be a losing battle to keep the Academy free of using the acquisition of federal research grants as the primary measure of academic excellence, a process that he felt corrupted academic freedom and integrity, and presented ethical risks and potential conflicts with intellectual endeavors. After he retired, I would run into him and Naomi from time to time in Lexington, and it was always delightful to see them. He always asked after my family and remained interested in my work. In short, Murray himself was a tour de force who for many years shaped the BU clinical psychology program and our students, and I feel lucky to have known him and benefited from his advice and wisdom. Would anybody like?
I'd like to get this mic up. Naomi, I would like to add a Brookhaven aspect to these wonderful comments we've heard this morning. I did not know Murray, obviously, before coming 7 years ago to Brookhaven. But one of the comments made today by the gentleman who offered the prayer connection prompts me to come forward to show you the connection that Murray had with many of us. John McMurray was a professor of mine, and John McMurray was the one who literally changed the direction of my thought by introducing me to Martin Buber. Martin Buber became central to much of the thinking that I have done. I've spent my life at Allegheny and Smith colleges teaching. Murray came in and took 3 of the Osher courses which I offered here at Brookhaven. And he was profoundly helpful and ultimately gracious. He and I became good friends. Half of our relationship was in German, the other half in English, and we enjoyed each other's company. I want to tell you that he may not have been a religious man, but he was a very spiritual man. I am an ordained United Methodist, which is a bad thing to say, it's around right now, clergyman. And we never felt that there was any contention between us. We appreciated Mary, we loved Mary, and I enjoyed being here with you and appreciate being able to speak.
This is from Alice Cronin Golum. Murray's passing has brought back memories of that time in our department. This would be the psychology department at BU. He was probably the most senior member of the clinical faculty when I arrived, and I remember him greeting me with, "We are colleagues," with sheer delight at the idea. Our scholarly interests couldn't have been more different, but occasionally he would surprise me about how wide his knowledge of psychology was. One day somebody was talking about subliminal perception, and he turned to me and said, "Can you believe these people don't know what the limb is? How could they not know the fundamentals of perception?" Back when clinical faculty used a very complicated point system to decide what applicants to admit, because almost nobody had grants, there had to be a consensus on who was going to get a student, and using one of those precious fellowships, training fellowships. Murray and I always interviewed the same applicants because we had the same teaching schedule on Friday afternoons, hence the same open times. He was Mr. Psychoanalyst, and I was the junior brain. We joked that he would start the interview with, tell me about your mother. And I would start it with, tell me about your favorite brain area. But when it came time to look at the scores, our inter-rater reliability was higher than any other pair of faculty. Maybe it was just something about people who were willing to teach on Friday afternoons. From Kathy Malley Morrison. I remember Murray well. He was always very kind to me, and he loved horseback riding. I'm glad he had a long life. May he rest in peace. I have one more. Would anybody else like to speak before I read this one? Marlon.
So I'm moved that so many people in here and such kindness. Murray was my dissertation chair, and I prolonged my dissertation beyond all belief, studying envy and jealousy in psychotic patients. It was an immense project. I think I took so long partly to hang around him. He gave him a martini at the end. One thing that I do remember particularly, because he was in that office with that analytic couch, and sometimes I would see him right after he had seen a patient. One time he said, I saw this patient, I didn't know what was going on, and I said to the patient, what am I missing? And I've never forgotten that moment. You have a snapshot memory sometime of somebody saying something to you, and that's a phrase I actually use. Last year I supervised 11 people at Cambridge Hospital, and I think I brought that particular question up once a week. it's one of those things, and it seems appropriate today to say, what am I missing? He was so curious, and it was such a gift to me, so I just wanted to say that.
Thank you.
I have one more from another beloved student. But before I read this one, I just want to announce that there are refreshments. Please stay and enjoy, and we can talk to each other. This is from Arnold Schneider, who I did not know personally, but I do remember that when Murray retired, he came up from Florida to attend the retirement party. I wish that I could be present with you today at Murray's memorial to honor my beloved mentor. He inspired me as a student, a psychologist, and a psychoanalyst. Gratefully, he became my friend. As a young student and supervisee, I remember feeling captivated by his knowledge, his empathy, and his passion, which he communicated in such a warm and loving manner. As his student, I experienced his belief in me, how he inspired me, and how he supported me when I applied for the Menninger postdoc fellowship. Looking back, without a doubt, Murray altered the course of my life. His greatness as a man stemmed from his generosity of time, his genuine excitement about teaching, his depth of insight, and his compassionate and tender heart, which he readily shared with us. Murray will always be alive in my mind, and he has a permanent place deep within my heart. The influence he has had on me and on so many others will never cease to exist. Thank you all for coming. Please enjoy.